We're pleased to have with us here today three outstanding photographers to talk about how women are changing history and the history of photography. And we're so pleased to have with us Sybylla Smith as the curator of this panel and as the moderator. Syb, as everyone calls her, is an independent curator, podcaster, and consultant specializing in concept development for artists. Her podcast, Concept Aware: How You See and Why It Matters, engages global photographers, curators, and critics in unscripted conversations to discuss creative practice and the photo bookmaking process. She's on a mission to amplify the work of women and female identifying photographers and to highlight underrepresented underrepresentative narratives with an intersectional lens. She has curated 30 plus solo and group exhibitions featuring over 115 international photographers in venues within the US, Mexico, Colombia, and Japan. This event is being recorded and will be posted to the SDN YouTube channel within a few days, and everybody who's registered for this event will get an email letting you know when it's ready. So please join me now in welcoming Sybylla Smith.
Thank you, Glenn. Welcome, everyone. Thank you for joining our conversation, and appreciation to the Social Documentary Network and their sponsors, Digital Silver Imaging and Leica Camera USA, for providing this global platform. I am immensely grateful to Aldeide, Susan, and Keisha for sharing their time, efforts, and expertise with us today. Aldeide founded and leads the Women Photographers International Archive, WOFA, that hosts a roster of Miami-based initiatives, including portfolio reviews, residencies, and book fairs. In addition, she curates an international convening, the WOFA Congress, a global collaborative matrix of moving parts. Just last night, Susan was awarded the International Center of Photography's Lifetime Achievement Award. Congratulations, Susan. Susan has pioneered a changing landscape of photography and contributed in immeasurable forms to the power of visual culture. She leads with curiosity, respect, and possesses an innate DNA of seeing collectively with interdependence and our shared humanity as her guide. Keisha has a national presence with 4 concurrent exhibitions of her contemporary work and curation being shown at the International Center of Photography, the Center of Photography Woodstock, Weber in Los Angeles, and Higher Pictures in Brooklyn. That's concurrently, and several are open right through May. Just this past week, she has been in conversation with Carla Williams, Tina Campt, and Makeda Best. Our panel is a mini WOFA reunion, and we have Aldeide to thank for hosting the 4-day Congress of Women Thinkers, Creators, Curators, and Academics convening from 5 continents to move our contemporary visual culture conversation forward. I had the privilege of interviewing Aldeide and Susan as part of my 7 podcast series on international women photographers. At the Congress, I witnessed the authenticity and agency of Keisha's work. I was not the sole audience member moved to tears. Today, we gather with these 3 artists, academics, and activists to explore their approach to archival practice and visual storytelling, and to offer an invitation to imagine archives not as static repositories, but as living conversations. History unfolds through prevailing cultural, social, and political viewpoints. Archives traditionally privileged a singular, colonial, and patriarchal framework, and consequently have limited whose stories are deemed worthy of preservation, study, exhibition, and acquisition. These women, through their image making, teaching, writing, curation, and scholarship, challenge prevailing viewpoints to document overlooked narratives, to amplify diverse lived experiences, and to expand what constitutes our visual history and contemporary cultural conversation. Through their work and witness, our understanding of the past expands while simultaneously transforming the possibilities of our future collective visual recording. What constitutes a canon moves beyond a fixed repository into a fluid instrument of possibility. I love the limitless reach each of these women engages to reshape and reclaim by activating visual narratives. They thrive on collaboration and search for potential. They center transparency and reciprocity. As a result, new definitions, methodologies, and vocabularies are being revealed as we widen the frame of what constitutes an archive to include our bodies, geographies, materials, and elements that hold our personal, political, and collective agency. So let's dive in. I will introduce each panelist with a brief bio and follow their presentation with an audience question or two. We will end in dialogue with our panelists responding to both audience questions and a few of my own. I begin with Aldeide. Aldeide Delgado. Aldeide Delgado is a Cuban-born, Miami-based, independent Latinx art historian and curator who is the founder and director of Women Photographers International Archive, WOFA. Her work focuses on feminist and decolonial perspectives within Latin American, Cuban, and Latinx photography contexts. She has lectured at prestigious institutions, including the Tate Modern, Perez Art Museum Miami, and the New School. Delgado is the author of Becoming Sisters, Women Photography Collectives and Organizations 2021, and created the online Feminist Archive, Catalog of Cuban Women Photographers. She has received multiple awards, including the Ellie's Creator Award in 2023 and the Knights Arts Challenge Award in 2019. Welcome, Aldeide.
Thank you so much. Mm. And you see the screen? And if I pass, you see it?
Yeah, looks good.
Okay, perfect. So thank you so much, Sib, for the invitation and give me the opportunity to be again in conversation with all of you, with Susan, with Keisha. Really is a pleasure. And of course, you have done like a beautiful and inspiring introduction. You have spoken very beautifully about our work. And really, I mean, my mind is just keep thinking because it's one thing is doing it, but then when you listen another person to speak about that work, it's just it has me right now like processing all what you said. So thank you as well for that. I am going to share a little bit of the work that I have been doing for the past 6 years as director and founder of Women Photographers International Archive. As Sybylla mentioned, I was born in Cuba. I moved to Miami in 2016, and that has been like my main, the place from where I have been developing and building WOFA. as an institution that seeks to rewrite the history of photography from a feminist and decolonial perspective. So I wanted to share some of the questions that I had, let's say at the beginning, in a very early moment in my career, that was like, well, what kinds of institutions dedicated to photography do we need today? And how can we challenge and subvert the patriarchal and colonial narratives within the history of photography? I'm going to use a set of questions as to guide my presentation to you today. So one of my inspirations in this notion or in this process of redefining the archive has been feminist geographer and social scientist Doreen Massey, particularly in her 1991 essay, A Global Sense of Place, where she defines place as an evocative mix of people of multiple ethnicities living and working side by side. A place, she said, is not static, it is not frozen in time. Rather, a place is a process constituted by social interactions that distinguish it from the outside. Its multiple identities and histories, along with the social relations that occur within it, define its specificity. And this is really important because I am going to conceive WOFA as a meeting place and understand photography as a collaborative tool for connecting and creating community. My other influence has been Chicana feminist poet and theorist Gloria Anzaldúa, who refers to the borderland between Mexico and the US in her semi-autobiographical book, Borderlands, La Frontera de New Mestiza, where she describes the borderland as a third space where people from multiple nationalities converge, languages cross-pollinate and are revitalized. According to Anzaldúa, a third space is where a new consciousness that is defined by multiple identities emerge. So I extrapolated the notion of the borderland between between Mexico and the US to the context of Miami and started to understand the city as a border space, as a border space across the Americas, as an international place, considering the border as an international place, and taking as well the idea of the border as a highly political place. So all of these elements were essential in my configuration of this archive from a political standpoint and an archive where relations are going to have like a central place, and also in understanding of the archive as a living organism, that trusts in process, and also where relations will be essential. Okay, so here is, so that's how Women Photographers International Archive emerged in 2018 with a mission to research, promote, support, and educate on the contributions of women and non-binary photographers to modern and contemporary art. The organization, as you reflected or documented, organized several programming throughout the year, including portfolio reviews, exhibitions at these residencies. Keisha was one of our residents in 2023. We also host talks, workshops, photo works. We archive and digitize the information by artists and making sure that the work is preserved for future generations. And of course, the WOFA Congress is our most ambitious event. It's a triennial convening that brings together worldwide women photographers, curators, and representatives from women photography organizations to discuss about urgent topics in the history of photography. And I'm going to address a little bit more about that. The organization works through four main pillars, which are the WOFA Library, the WOFA Institute, or WOFA Studio, and the WOFA Congress. And I wanted to share a little bit of how this project started. Sybylla mentioned that my background, my background goes back to Cuba, where I studied art history. And I wanted to share a little bit of how my interest in photography and my interest in documenting began, and particularly in 2013, when I was studying art history in the University of Havana. This is the status of the studies about photography at that moment, as you see here, from a total of 491 dissertations for the bachelor and PhD, for bachelor degree in art history and dissertation for PhD in art science. Only 1.48% of those theses were dedicated to the study of photography. At the same time, there doesn't exist like a complete book about the photography of the history of photography in the island. And most of these publications, like for example, this article from 1979, is what we have. And it includes like 318 photographs and only 8 photographs accredited by women photographers. And this is one of the essential main bibliographies that I found at that moment. Oops. This is another example. Key bibliographic reference as well, Cuba 100 Years of Photography, published in 1998, includes 52 photographers, only 5 women photographers. So what we are seeing here is a complete, a lack of recognition to the work of women artists, women photographers, that along with the scarce of bibliography regarding the manifestation of contemporary photography in the context of the island, forced me or calls me to the process of building the catalog of Cuban women photographers, which was the first comprehensive approach to Cuban photography history from a feminist perspective. At that moment, the catalog was presented as a project that goes back from the 19th century to 2013, creating a kind of online database where you can find the biography, the artist statement, and a selection of work of these artists. One of the main contributions of the catalog of Cuban women photographers was finding the female division of the Cuban Photography Club. The Cuban Photography Club was the most important photographic institution dedicated to the promotion of photography as arts during the Republican period that goes from 1902 to 1959. And I remember that while I was studying, I found too many times people that told me, well, there are no women photographers in Cuba. If there are not good. So really, this is a very like frustrating process of research, in where I was going literally page by page of newspapers, catalogs, trying to find information about women photographers in history. And when I found about this female division of the Cuban Photography Club, I mean, it was one of the days of more joy that I had. And these women, they were most of the time the sisters, the daughters of the men that were affiliated with the institution. They decide to get together as the articles of incorporation reflected to were with the purpose. I mean, they get it together as a lawful purpose of life to promote among those who constituted, I mean, those who are members of the club, the love of photography as art and its practice, employing for this goal excursions, parties, brunches, or any other similar activities. The female division of the Cuban Photography Club was in charge of doing film screenings, of doing the fundraising activities of the institution. They were very active, and for me have been a great inspiration because, and as we are going to see later, it helped me understand that photography is a collaborative practice, because all of these women were working together. We're creating a platform for making visible each other, but also it was part of the discussion of the idea of being modern in the context of Cuba in the 50s. I don't have too much time to go into the details, and I like a little bit running here, but I wanted to share with you some of the examples of the artwork of the women that were part of this institution. And then I have been presenting in different academic settings, such as at the New School or at the Coral Gables Museum in Miami or at the Tate Modern. I have been presenting about this research and also contributed to the book Una Historia. Oh, I am reading it in Spanish, like a world history of women photographers. I mean, a great book that we also had the honor of presenting during the first edition of the Congress in 2021. A very collaborative project as well that include 300 women photographers and 160 women authors from around the world. I wanted to share as part of the work that I have been doing with WOFA a little bit of the exhibitions and the artists that have been that I have been supporting through the work, and these are some of the examples. In this case, Carlotta Bolcher with this series from taken in San Francisco during the 70s, which is phenomenal. And I am just sharing this with the hope that you find inspiration and that you give you like a sneak peek so you can look and find more information about them online. This is Marta Maria Perez Bravo, as well considered like the first photographer in Cuba who exclusively used her body to address gender issues. In this case, responding to her while she was pregnant with twins, and she mixed that with all the spiritual practice of Cuba, the Afro-Cuban practice of Santeria. So she mixed that through her work. Maria Magdalena Campos, of course, Katia Garcia, Nuka Barroso. These all are projects from the 90s that redefine the position of the female body. Silvia Lizama, with this great series that speaks about her process in exile. She moved to Miami in the 70s, and at that moment, the series, the TV series, respond to the how the TV at that moment was a great influence and how exiled people were learning the American culture through the TV programs. Maria Martínez Cañas, Gertrudis Ribalta. And I want to make a stop here on this project of Nereida Garcia Ferraz. Is the project that is in the cover of the book Becoming Sisters, and other great inspirations to me. And this is a project, Nereida, she's a Cuban artist. She did this project in collaboration with Eugenia Vargas from Chile and Laura Gonzalez, another artist from Mexico, and respond to the process in where they met. They were students at the Art Institute of Chicago at the end of the 80s. And one day they decide to, as they tell, they saw each other speaking in Spanish, and they said, "Oh my God, we need to be friends," just because they were Latinas. They were Latinas in a highly, as they said, cold city. And just because of that, and because the influence that at that moment they had in the work, they had from the work of other artists such as Ana Mendieta, they decided to spend one day in the dunes of Michigan to taking photographs of themselves with Polaroids and sharing, while sharing a meal, but also at the end, it was like a celebration of the practice of being together. They, when this kind of photo performance ended, they distributed the photograph in equal parts among them. And those photographs stayed in that way in their studios until I found them 30 years later. So I was able to bring them for the first time after 30 years in the contest of the Congress in 2021. It was like a very special moment, and was an opportunity for them for unveiling this project that was let's say like hidden during all this, or in silence during all this time. But it's a project as well about collaboration, but also a project that represents that idea of the feminist photography in the sense of how they were the authors, the subjects, but also the main audience for that work. And also it's a project that speaks about the position of them as Latina women in the context of the US in a highly political scenario where they needed to teach to people or to break certain stereotypes regarding what does it mean to be Latin, or Latinx or Latino here. So going back to the question at the beginning regarding what kind of institutions dedicated to photography do we need today and how can we challenge and subvert the patriarchal and colonial narratives within the history of photography, I now want to go quickly to another of my inspirations, that is Edward Glissant. And during the past years, I have been researching about the Caribbean intellectual thinking, and through that, looking as well for ways of challenging the history of photography. For Edward Glissant, through an archipelagic thinking, we see the world metaphorically as a collection of islands connected to each other, engaging with exchange, fluids, mobilities, and border crossings. This imaginary is essential or has allowed me to decentralize single and linear narratives of photography history by embracing multiplicity and connections with other people, places, and species who share similar struggles and experiences. So this has been one of the main references for the creation of the book, Becoming Sisters, Women Photography Collectives and Organizations, with was published in 2021 in tandem with the WOFA Congress, a triennial convening that brings together worldwide women photography collectives and organizations, are historians, theorists, and curators who document the history of women photographers from the 19th century through today. The event presents both national and international discussions about women and feminism in the history of photography, and at the same time constitutes a platform to celebrate women and provide an unparalleled network for the international community of women in the photographic arts. The book Becoming Sisters serves as a registry and collective manifesto of 138 international women and non-binary photographers, collectives, and organizations reframing photography history. In the essay spread across 5 sections of the book, I argue that the creation of communities of women photographers based on tenets of solidarity and networking have been a fundamental strategy used historically and through the press to highlight the contributions of women in the photographic arts. And to prove this thesis, the essay that I wrote references the collaborative photo performance picnic that I just mentioned, as well, and also the Ovular Feminist Photography workshops held in Oregon during 1979 to 1983, the London Journal by and about women, Black women working in photography, Polarized, and the feminine division of the Photography Club in Cuba. The book includes like one page for each of the organizations, along with a statement and information about where they were funded, who are the funders, and as well as the website. It's a tool. I like to create useful things. So this is like an actual tool for learning and finding opportunities about what other colleagues are doing for supporting women photographers.
Aldeide, I'm going to jump in and ask my own question. How people can get the book now. And if that could get put in the chat, that would be terrific. And also, I saw it as a connector, that I saw the resource. It's how I found you. It's how I found the Congress. And it is invaluable. Someone in the chat wrote, as soon as you brought the cover up, an incredible book. In the nature of time, just looking at, do you have a few more slides, or or where are we?
No, I'm just going to finish. I can go
Okay,
very
perfect.
quickly, and I am
Okay,
going to put in the chat how they can get the book. So
perfect.
thank you so much, but it's on the website wofacongress.org. And just to finish, I just wanted to say, like 40 organizations are documented in the book within these 8 island systems. And the book is activated through monthly meetings, was activated and keeps being activated through monthly meetings that took place during the pandemic, like as we are seeing here, or during the congresses, as we are seeing in these images, or later as well with other activities. Um, and this is like one of our recent collaborations as well. It's very important for WOFA, the idea of partnerships and collaborations. And thinking again as the archive, one of the terms that I also like is the idea of contamination, and how through this kind of partnerships that we establish with preeminent institutions, we are able to provoke a change in the program. So to end, I just would like to highlight that the WOFA Congress produced an international gathering defined by the social interactions of sisterhood and solidarity. It marks a paradigm shift as we displace the discussion from the realm of the camera and the right to see others' work to focus on relationality and the collaborative nature of the photographic art. So thank you so much. And here is my contact information. And well,
Wow, thank you so much, so much. And I was so excited to see the photographs of the last Congress, and I participated in the first one because it was virtual. And yeah, and you can live stream. Do we want to take, I think how we're setting this up, take a question? I actually can see one from Paul Gottlieb, so I can share that. He asked in the chat, are there currently active women photographers on the island? And have they been given the status women have earned in other countries?
Well, yes, there are current women photographers there, and even, I mean, there is a very complex situation right now in Cuba in the sense of the artistic production and like a general crisis in the country. Most of the population have migrated, and they are now all displaced around the world. But yeah, for sure, there are women photographers there, and I am in contact with many of them who also look for WOFA as an opportunity to get support for their practice. And the second part of the question, I don't remember.
What is the status that they're given? Is there equal status?
What does that mean?
Basically, the question fully was, have they been given the status women have earned in other countries? And I can just preface that with, if they have, it is not a lot. There isn't a country.
Unfortunately, something that happens in Cuba as well is that when you leave, in many of the cases, there is a kind of process of erasure for the people who leave. And that has happened with me. And I don't know, there are people that if you look online, people are going to know about my work, but I am for sure, I know a person that is mentioned in Cuba. So yeah, unfortunately, I haven't seen the situation have changed that much in the context of the Iceland, but well, there are too many things that need to be fixed there.
I hear you. And I'm going to move on to Susan, and I just want to let people know that there's a really great question waiting out there on resources in reference to colonialism and its influence on the archive. I'd like to keep that to the end because I think that would be a great question for a larger dialogue. Let me introduce Susan. Susan Meiselas is a documentary photographer based in New York who joined Magnum Photos in 1976. She's known for her documentation of human rights issues in Latin America, particularly her coverage of the Nicaraguan insurrection. Meiselas has authored numerous books, including Carnival Strippers in 1976, Nicaragua in 1981 on its fourth printing, and Carnival Strippers Revisited 2022. Her work has been exhibited internationally and is included in major collections worldwide. She has received numerous prestigious awards, including a MacArthur Fellowship in 1992, a Guggenheim Fellowship in 2015, the Women in Motion Award in 2019, and the Deutsche Borsche Photography Prize in 2019. Since 2007, she has served as president of the Magnum Foundation, working to expand diversity and creativity in documentary photography. Welcome, Susan. You have to unmute. Hang on, you're muted.
How's that?
Perfect. That's perfect.
Are you seeing the
Welcome.
screen? Because it's a little bit confusing. Okay, great,
Yes.
great. So thanks. It is kind of like a reunion, though we didn't all, the four of us didn't have that much time together in the crazy, amazing, most ambitious, probably conference I've ever been to in 2 days. I think there were so many circles of connections, and I love the energy you bring to that, Aldeide. You know, you bring us together with all the differences and challenges that we face more and more. And I love listening to Keisha there, and I've seen some of the work she's just been presenting in New York that maybe she'll share with you all. I feel a little like I was torn between Sybylla, on one hand, hoping I would present the collaboration book. That's much harder for me to do in 15 minutes. This is a little bit easier in the sense that I'm going to really kind of reverse the focus of gathering and collecting and archiving, curating others, but just looking at my own archive over time. And I'm going to start with just what it is to make the process over stages, because some of you may know the work, but whether or not you understand the interaction of the work being made and then being processed and revisited over time. So I'm going to move quickly through what is probably, I guess now, what is it, it's not quite a 45-year history of working with my own archive with these works. So the beginning privilege of being an American, not knowing anything about the history of Nicaragua, reading about the assassination of Pedro Joaquin Chamorro, the opposition newspaper editor under the dictatorship of Somoza. Text, no pictures. So what really brings me to Nicaragua initially is trying to understand what's happening. And of course, when you're doing this kind of work, documentary, you don't know what you're going to find. You don't know how long that work will have a kind of life. And that's part of what I'm going to share with you. So this is the more the documentation and less about the appropriations, mine and others, which I'll touch on later. So there's a tension between the historical value of the images, the aesthetic value of them, my personal versus collective memory. But the first thing in this kind of work is becoming a trusted observer, especially as an American. So I think I was motivated through this period. I basically spent a year in and out of Nicaragua through various transitions that lead to the popular insurrection and eventually the overthrow of Somoza. But what motivates me as a photographer is this idea of both timely and timeless images. So I'm looking at the present. I think I'm also thinking in the future, how will they be seen as past? Not as news, but really as history. That's very important to the kind of motivation to be there, to stay and trace both their historical process and my own in the making of images. So I would say, just as a footnote, it's not like the war in Vietnam with the North and South. It's not like Ukraine with Russia and Ukraine. It is more like Israel and Gaza in the sense that the people who are, it is not like that where the people themselves can document because there is no fluidity across borders. So these are very different conditions. The condition in Central America was that you moved in and out of and in constant motion, I would say, working with intuition, no communication, way before cell phones, etc. So I'm looking at and trying to understand at the same time, discover what is hidden at this period of an underground movement. The interrogation of the bus passengers is to see whether or not they have anything in their pockets that would reveal, what their associations are. Of course, I can't not see this picture and not think about what's happening in the US today, where there's no evidence, but people are deported, people are not yet disappeared. And that's what was really beginning to happen in Nicaragua as I came to find out. By coincidence, because I'm there before any reporting of significance is done, this is the first cover that I have in the media. I'm not working with them. I'm not working for them. I'm working with them. So they're reproducing my photographs. This being the first one of the New York Times, which really announces the fact that there is a civil war of some sort evolving in Nicaragua. I think, when I look back at this work, the real focus was the protagonist making history in the streets. But I'm also starting to feel that tension around the responsibility of representation. I'm not sure. I'm making the photographs are circulating. It's not yet the time of Instagram in which I'm controlling that flow, but I'm trying to track what happens to photographs. So I'm going to give you a little feeling of how that happens. This is actually a photograph made July 16th. It's the eve before Somoza leaves the country. So it becomes a symbolic and celebratory gesture of defiance. It's really of great importance. I don't see it that way. It's one part of the sequence of the book that I make. I make the book understanding it's got to be a bicultural object. It has to speak to the Nicaraguans as a record of their history and process, and to those who have watched from afar. Another factor that influences the feeling of urgency to do the book was that during the war, the opposition newspaper's archive was destroyed by a bomb. So the foreigners had Nicaraguan history. That was a kind of an assault on the history. The opposition, obviously, was archive was destroyed. And I was feeling that I had photographs, but they had a revolution, and that the revolution was much more interesting than a set of photographs. Nonetheless, I backed the photographs that foreigners had made for the first anniversary. And that's of the triumph over Somoza in July 1979. And I begin to discover that my photographs, which have been circulating in media, are being reappropriated by the Nicaraguans in a multitude of ways. I'm just going to trace two images that have particular lives. This was a tourist poster made by the people in Monimbo, where I made the photograph initially. So in a sense, I feel this is a repatriation. In other words, I'm welcoming anyone making work from the work that I've made. A very different rendering is the man that you saw in the photograph becomes a symbol through the fact that he's wearing a cross. He's a revolutionary Christian from their point of view, and he celebrated the first anniversary. There are more images. I'm going to keep moving just so you get a sense of the flow. This is him being painted, not in the town he comes from, but painted on the walls of Messiah, along with other legends of that period. And as the Contra War, motivated and paid for by the US, it was a covert war initially, right, called the Contra War. Coming in from Honduras, threatening to come in from Costa Rica. The Molotov man was the symbol that they stenciled on the walls with the words no pasarán, coming from the Spanish Civil War. So this idea that the symbol is motivating a popular militia to fight against the possibility of this invasion coming from the US, supported by the US. I then just get this piece of paper in the mail, which really was startling. No address, of course, but they're using the Molotov men to raise money against the Sandinistas and mobilizing for the covert war by the Contras, the freedom fighters, President Reagan's freedom fighters. I go back on the 10th anniversary, and interestingly, that wall is blackened out. I think it's important to note that that power of that resonant image was too great for it's right at the point that the Sandinista elections are to be held. So erasing history, this idea that history has to be erased and reclaimed. But obviously, I don't always control the context in which the images are seen. It leads me to be interested really in who the people are at the point of this 10th anniversary. In fact, in the one part of the history is that the Sandinistas are voted out of power. Another question is, how have the people that have participated and been the protagonists throughout this period, how are they living with what they remember and what they dreamed of, etc. So that's the motivation of making a film called Pictures from Revolution. I kind of go around town with that very the photographic book, and turn the pages and try to find the people in the photographs. So here you don't see me doing it. I'm going to show you in a moment, the clip, but this is me going around. People are writing on the pages of the book, telling me where I might find someone named Pablo Quirós Arauz, who I only know at the time as the Molotov Man or Barreta. So this is a very short clip just to give you a feeling of I hope you can hear it. Yeah.
Yeah, we're not hearing the sound. At least I'm not hearing
You're
it.
not. Uh-oh, that's a problem. Well, you can read it. Can you read it? I hope you
Yeah,
can
yeah,
read
we
it.
can see the
Yeah,
subtitles.
sorry. I don't know why the sound isn't coming through. I probably had to change some setting.
Yeah.
I'm sorry you couldn't hear the sound, but if you could read the subtitles, at least there's another clip with subtitles. I don't think I can change with the time we have. I'm just going to glimpse through a few more things because I think it's about how images inspire other engagement with what, in this case, the Molotov Man represented at the 25th anniversary of the revolution in his hometown. A monument is built. I go back again in the 25th anniversary, and this is really about how do these photographs live in the history of Nicaraguans? What do they remember? What of it? Because half the country is under 25. What can they, I'm not just putting my murals up. I'm working with the Institute of History from the local university. And we're going back to the sites where I make the photographs and people are beginning to interact. We don't have enough time for me to show that clip, but you can see it. It's called Reframing History. There are clips on my website. I'll put it in the chat. I just want to finish with saying, there are lots of ways in which these images get repatriated, reappropriated in public space, in this case in Nicaragua. And then in 2018, I get something via the Facebook, and this is really disturbing. Someone's referring to the photograph I made 40 years later and their demonstrations against the Sandinistas, President Ortega in particular, in the streets 40 years later. So I see these tensions of what photographs are doing. The Molotov Man reappears, but the armed resistance is reclaiming him. And that's an interesting tension. So I'm thinking a lot about whose resistance has led to the necessity of their exile, and obviously unexpected migration. Many of them there were people who were arrested, there were people who were killed, there were people forced into as political prisoners. One of the things that I've done is sort of in response to just both making a postcard and part of the exhibition, seeing the wall of all the stages of the Molotov Man. They're always present in the exhibitions, these voices. So you see the video below in that exhibition, the voices of the people that I came to meet and their reflections, looking back at that frozen moment of the photograph in relation to their ongoing lives. And the last thing I'm just going to, I have two quick things. hopefully this plays. It doesn't have sound. But migration, something we're living a lot with. We're living with deportations now. One of the shows that still resonates for me, though I did this in 1990, is you're seeing photographs from Nicaragua and El Salvador uh, intersecting with photographs of what we would call, I'm calling crossings as a show of people coming into the USA. So I'm thinking about them carrying their memories unknown to most who they were, whatever the purposes were. But of course, now these deportations are really haunting. And I'm just going to end with another way of working with this archive, which is somewhat different. You'll be able to read the subtitles, I hope. This is the latest edition, fourth edition of Nicaragua. It just came out from Aperture. And I'm using QR codes, as you see, cutting up the 90-minute film into short clips, 2 to 3 minutes. So that same feeling of whose history is being told by whom. And we'll just give you one very quick sample. So I'm sorry that you couldn't hear, but at least I hope you could read the subtitles. I think really what I'm saying is that these are ongoing stories. I corrected myself last night saying stories are really narratives, and stories sound like they have beginnings, middles, and ends. And really, I think of the narrative flow of history, those who participated, those who were spectators, those who have memories as children of their parents. I'm constantly in a flow of the memory of how those photographs have intersected in the world. And that's kind of what the focus of at least this presentation was. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Susan. Wow, I'm going to ask if there's a question coming from the audience. You can raise your hand or unmute. Or write in the chat.
Or keep going.
Got you. Okay, we will keep going. I'm going to introduce Keisha Scarville. Keisha Scarville is a Brooklyn-born artist who explores themes of loss, latency, and the elusive body in her work. Her photography has been exhibited widely, including at the Studio Museum of Harlem, ICA Philadelphia, the Brooklyn Museum of Art, and Higher Pictures. Her work is held in prestigious collections, including the Smithsonian Museum of American Art, Yale University Art Gallery, and the Detroit Institute of Arts. She received the Creator Lab Photo Fund and the Saltzman Prize in Photography in 2023. Scarville is currently a visiting professor at Harvard University and faculty at Parsons School of Design. Her first book, Lick of Tongue, Rub of Finger on Soft Wound, was shortlisted for the 2023 Aperture Paris Photo Book Awards. Welcome, Keisha.
Thank you. Well, I don't even know how to follow up to amazing presentations, to be quite honest. I'm just gonna start this. Can everyone see my screen?
Perfect.
So, I mean, of course, before I begin, thank you for inviting me. And I remember, seeing who else was going to be on the panel, and my response was like, I don't know if I'm supposed to be on this panel. And Sybylla, you were like, yeah, you're supposed to be on this panel. But it is a humbling honor to share space with Aldeide and Susan, two women who I deeply respect and admire. And, Sybylla in Miami, was just such a wonderful experience. So, I'm just thankful that, the universe brought us back together in this way. So I'm gonna try to kind of do this in 15 minutes, and I'm going to really adhere to that. So in thinking about archive and thinking about like the title of the panel, the title of the discussion in terms of, what is it that we bring forward? I always love to start with this image of my parents. Taken in 1968. My parents migrated to the United States from Guyana, South America. My dad first came in 1967, and my mom followed in early 1968. And my mother is actually pregnant with my older brother in this image. And this is an image that I come back to over and over again because it ties into so many things that I'm thinking about in relationship to the archive. And more specifically, thinking about how are we in the presence of our histories? And also, what are the things that are latent within the archive? And, I think about this image and I think about archives as having like future implications in that we don't know, or some narratives unfold only in the future. And so there are the things that are happening within the image when the image is being taken, but then there's the life of the image. And, for me, in my case, almost 50 years later. And so I'm thinking about that, and also I'm thinking about the legibility of the archive. So all of these things I'm going to be kind of speaking to on some level in the way in which I approach photography specifically. So I'm going to be sharing like two projects that are kind of tied into exhibitions that I have currently up here in New York City. And the first project that I've been working on for over 10 years is a project about my father's first passport image. Back in 2012, I had decided that I wanted to have a conversation with both of my parents about their experiences here in America, and how did they see the landscape of America? How had it changed? And also, how had their feelings and thoughts about Guyana had shifted? And at the time, my dad had recently retired. And I asked him, if he was planning on going back to Guyana. And, he immediately said no. He's like, I don't see myself as Guyanese anymore. I'm American. And so that, just like that simple statement from my father, I am American, really impacted me, and just kind of really just kind of settled with me in a way that it just I couldn't make sense of it at the time. And, there was something of this idea of like, what does it mean to claim a land as part of one's identity? And specifically in this case, like, what does it mean to claim a land as part of one identity, and when that land is not the place of your birth? And so I started to think about, like, what did it mean for my father? But also, what is the implication and interpretations of being American for me? And so I wanted to create a project around that spoke to that. And my dad, he had gifted me his very first passport image that was taken of him when he was 16 years old in Guyana. And I had it framed on my dresser. And, while thinking about, this statement, this kind of declaration of I am American, I kept coming back to his passport image. I kept looking at it. And, I think it was one of those things where I was studying the image up until that point, I was studying the image because it represented someone who I didn't know. I know my dad as my dad, you know, and everything that I know of him from the time I was born. And so having this image that was taken of him before I was even a thought, you know, I started to kind of think about like, how does the image allow for us or allowed me to engage with a history that I was not, you know, privy to. And so you know, I decided that I made a bunch of, I scanned the passport and I made a bunch of copies of it. And there were these conversations that were coming up for me in terms of like the functionality of the passport photo. You know, I've spoken a lot about like this kind of disturbing neutrality that I find to be true of a lot of ID photos. You know, the ways in which we are flattened and neutralized, and the way in which the ID photo is kind of meant to kind of establish a placing and validity of a person. And so I started to kind of embark on this idea of like, what does it mean to kind of disturb that? Like, what does it mean to kind of uncover and to engage and excavate like all of these kind of latent histories or latent narratives that are embedded in the image that is not necessarily there visually, but how do I, by way of gesture and hand, make all of that visible? And there are things I think are, you know, there's things that I think that are really interesting in terms of like photography's relationship to time and temporality. And passport photos being so unique in that they are one of the images that we take with the intention of our body having future movement. And so there was something about that for me as well, that all of these things I wanted to kind of like bring into, you know, this kind of investigation of my dad's passport image. And so I just wanted to kind of think about, you know, I started to kind of think about all these conversations around one's identity, but also one's history, in ways in which to bring that into the image. And so there were these engagements with history, and it was very important to me by way of collage and other materials that to have this kind of materiality, you know, activation into the kind of two-dimensional flatness of the passport. And so it was really important to me that any of the source materials that I looked to, that there was something of the body that was in resistance. And so those were things that, you know, that I was kind of, you know, considering in relationship to my approach to the work. You know, so some of the images are informed by his experiences coming here. So a lot was kind of dealing with, you know, his accent, and that accent having to be kind of translated. And so there's this kind of combination of, you know, his experiences, but also, you know, the potential becomings of my father. And so I'm also thinking about like, what if my dad, what if my dad, you know, in coming here became a superhero? And so thinking about that as well, in terms of how I approach the project. And so particularly with collage, you know, I was really, you know, really interested in kind of like taking bits and pieces from like all these like visual, like, and taking bits and pieces from visual culture, and bringing all of these kind of disparate parts and building out these narratives and building out or bringing in this like this multitude of conversations or this multitude of existences into the way in which my dad's body is being represented. A story that I love to tell in relationship to this work is, one of the questions I asked my father about why America. That was, when folks were making this mass exodus out of Guyana. They were going to, and this was happening in the late 1960s. They were going to America. They were going to England, or they were going to Canada. And I asked my dad, why America? And his immediate response was the movies. And so there's something I think that is so incredibly seductive about American cinema. And it does what it is meant to do. And so while sourcing materials for this project, I found this puzzle piece of all of Sidney Poitier's most iconic roles. And Sidney Poitier, who is a Caribbean, was Caribbean, may he rest in peace, was a Caribbean who migrated to the US and kind of like fulfilled this idea of this kind of American dream. I was kind of looking through the puzzle pieces, and I found one of those puzzle pieces of Sidney Poitier and laid it over my dad's face. And so this project began in 2012. And what started to happen is it became part of my daily practice. So, when I'm not photographing, but this is something that I'm doing every day, I'm sitting down with his passports and kind of creating different iterations of this piece. And it has now kind of ballooned. Initially, I think I was just kind of striving for 50, but it's now ballooned into over 300 different iterations of this, and counting. It's a project that I've kind of committed myself to that doesn't necessarily have an end. It's an ongoing conversation, and a conversation that I think is just kind of always necessary to have. In terms of like what the image represents, but also specifically in relationship to this kind of tenuous space of citizenship, particularly what's happening here in America. So the show that's up right now at Higher Pictures in Brooklyn is housing 322 of the passports. And in terms of laying out the show, we thought that as people entered the space, kind of having them all kind of laid out in this kind of singular linear line, or this linear way of showing it, like something, very straightforward and very rote, which, kind of speaks to like this kind of practice or the process of having one's passport taken. But I knew at a certain point within the gallery space, I wanted to disrupt that line and just have it more scattered or become a constellation. And so at a certain point, that is kind of that linear way of kind of thinking about the images and the laying out the images is broken apart. And there was something of the diaspora or diasporic movements that I wanted to kind of bring to how the images are shown. So another show that is up currently at the International Center of Photography is a show titled To Conjure Recent New Archives in Recent Photography. I always mess up the title. That I had the pleasure of co-curating with Elizabeth Sherman and Sarah Iko at ICP. And it was my first time doing a curatorial project that I was also part of, meaning some of my work was being shown. But it was really important to us, from the jump, is kind of thinking about curation as collaboration and collectivity, and kind of creating space, the conversations that we wanted to kind of bring to what was of interest to us in terms of like what photographers were doing, but also thinking about how archive was kind of being thought of differently. And so we had a series of conversations, and, the two things we just kind of kept coming back to was not thinking about archive as like this kind of thinking about archive as like this kind of corrective engagement, but thinking about how are photographers or artists that are kind of engaging photography to think of new ways of what an archive can be. And so, so how are artists and how are visual image makers, or how are image makers kind of thinking about what's outside of the institutional archive and engaging materials like clothing and in the landscape as places to kind of activate archive or activate histories. And so one of the questions we kind of kept coming back to was, what does an archive for the future look like? And by this, I mean, like, what, how, and where are the containers for what gets carried forward? And how are these artists kind of engaging latencies in a different way? And so, I had, the incredible honor and privilege of working with some artists that I really love and admire as well. And thinking about, how is this kind of collectivity being brought to the space itself? And what are the conversations and cross-pollination of ideas happening within that space? So first, I want to start with one of the artists, Tara Kragnack. Her project, 1979 Contact Negatives. It might be hard to see, but this is Tara in the space. Tara, who was born in Lima, Peru, but not raised there, while very, very, very young, was adopted and brought here to the United States. And so and she was born in 1979. And so has been making a series of trips back to Lima and gathering archival information specifically from the year 1979, and creates these installations where she's projecting these images onto these different surfaces. And for the first week of the exhibition, she placed herself within the installation and created a series of images. And so thinking about ways in which one can insert themselves into the archive when there are no images that are existing of her. So there's kind of ways in which to kind of embed oneself and inhabit the archive. Shayla Miller, who's also in the exhibition, her project Obsidian. Here in Shayla's work, which is quite beautiful, is kind of thinking about, the body of the radical Black woman, and created a speculative archive. So she kind of recreated newspaper clippings, advertisements, and all of which are kind of inhabiting, this way, thinking about archives that hold rage, archives that hold anger, and wanting to kind of create a speculative archive, or coming up with a main character that is kind of the activator within this particular space. Koyo and we're looking at, in all cases, we're looking at the artist in the work. Koyo, who is pulling from her own Indigenous knowledge and engagement with her own Indigenous knowledge, and creating a series of vessels and instruments, and in some cases, knows the making of it, but the knowledge of how to play them is something that has been lost over time. So there's this way of kind of trying to reconnect in that sense, and using instruments and using music as a place to kind of inhabit the archive. In this image, she's creating all of these herself. In this image, we see her and her daughter, where she's trying to teach her daughter, what she's learned about how to play these instruments. Sasha Wartzel, an amazing filmmaker who's been doing a documentary on the Everglades, where she is from. And one of the things we were thinking about with Sasha's work, and this is all coming from a documentary that she has out right now called Rivers of Grass, where she's kind of looking at the colonial history of Florida, of the Everglades, but also thinking about like what is happening in terms of environmental impact currently within that area. So thinking about land as archive as well in Sasha's work. Widleen Cadet, an artist that I love, I've known her for so long, who migrated here from Haiti, and is kind of in bringing in folktale, some of the stories that she grew up with, and kind of creating these images that speaks to not only her migration, but also thinking about the migrant body and how the migrant body stores narratives and histories and time. And has been creating these architectural pieces where taking some memories of, the landscape in her home where she grew up, is recreating particular walls and placing them directly over the photograph. I'm just gonna go a little faster.
You know what?
And then,
Excuse me one sec. Sorry, Keisha. I want to make sure that that there are time for questions, and I know that Susan is going to leave to teach. So if you can tell me how many more slides do you think?
I'll end with the Camila.
Okay, perfect.
Well, actually, Camila and then me. So Camila's work. Camila's work, Camila Janan Rashid, her practice engages language and is using bits and pieces of what she's experiencing within her memory, but also within her dreams, and creating these markings and using language. And so thinking about the psyche as its own archive. And then lastly, and I'll end here, my work is also part of the exhibition as well. And this is coming from a series that I've done around my mother's clothing, in the wake of her passing. And so kind of thinking about ways in which the clothing kind of creates its own archival space as well. So in the exhibition, I'm just going to move a little bit forward. So in the exhibition, I'm kind of activating objects alongside the photographs and creating fabric pieces to place over the images. So one has to kind of contend with and see through and this kind of layering of narratives. And I will end here.
Well, thank you so much. I have to say that in my thinking about your work and all the layers of conjuring, I think of water as part of the archive. And just how we're going into elements. I wanted to mention the book that that Susan worked on with an esteemed group of women, 5 altogether over 10 years, collaboration, A Potential History of Photography. And why I bring it up is that when someone had asked about resources on colonialism, in the manifesto that is literally called Toward a Manifesto, it outlines the violence of our partial history and of what has been the traditional canon. And I just wanted to ask or put out there, one of the things that you've said, Keisha, in terms of motivating your work was that you were moving against an oppressive aesthetic. And I think that motivating is so prevalent now in all these examples of women working. And I wanted to just bring that out. Let me see if, oh, so people are asking about the collaborations. It is a combination. There you go. Thank you. Thank you, Susan. Let me ask if there's a question from the audience. I have
Sybil, one thing I could just say quickly before I have
Please.
to really, I'm
Yeah.
sorry, these two things are compressing into each other, and we don't have more time to interact. But the collaboration book, the thing that if you do find it somewhere or ask for it in a bookstore, ideally, you'll see that there are 8 different chapters. We call them not clusters rather than chapters. The idea that they're a cluster of ideas that come together, one of which is called The Photographed Person Was Always There. So it opens up a set of images made by different authors in relation as protagonists in relation to those that they've been in dialogue with. I mean, we could have talked about this, but we chose something else, so I hope you can explore it. I think the main thing is that there's a historical framework within each one of those clusters, but you will find many of the works, I think that unfortunately not Keisha's work, though it could well have been, had it existed when we did this book, it came, I guess we wrapped it 4 or 5 years ago. So, everything is in time, and certainly it's not seen as an authoritative book. It's an exploration. And I leave you guys. I'm sorry,
Oh,
but I
thank you
wish you
so
well.
much.
Thank you.
Thank you for carving this out.
Thanks.
Super
Bye.
Thanks.
See you
appreciate.
soon.
Thank you,
Thanks.
Susan.
I want to be able to say a couple of things that kind of wrap this. Just as Susan mentioned, that book was 5 academics and artists over 10 years, and it is such a generative piece of work, as is what Aldeide put together. And I think that is my understanding of what women and non-binary photographers are bringing forward, is this expansiveness and moving out of a better, or not better, best, greatest, iconic, ideal way of seeing. That is what had been a framework, and we are blowing that out of the water, hopefully. And one thing I wanted to say was that I referenced back to other times people were speaking, and we recently lost a very special voice in photography with Nona Faustein's passing, very unexpectedly, and certainly before anyone wanted that to happen. Nona spoke of the DNA, and she spoke of us carrying DNA and the DNA of our ancestors, and that we as artists are in a role to decipher the code, to interpret the stories. And I really feel that everyone that's spoken today, all of our artists, activists, do that, and do that beautifully and across a wide range of methodologies. So one thing I just want to say, and I will open up for a question after I say this, it's that there is Higher Pictures has put together a fundraiser for Nona's family, and you can find that at Higher Pictures on their website, and I would hope people would think about that. And I wanted to share a quote from Nona, because when she got out of graduate school and she'd had enough with the canon that was filled with dead white men, she said that she wanted to go on a mission, and I quote her, and that is to kick that shit open. And I am hoping that that is exactly what we're on our way to doing, and that it continues. And I also wanted to give a shout out to the people that came up, people like Marilyn Nance, Cheryl Miller, whose archives are really important, and how we're uncovering all of this and reactivating our history. So we're getting thank yous. I want to know, thank you for putting the GoFundMe in the chat. I love someone wrote plurality versus singularity. And one of my questions was going to be this threshold of between personal vision and a collectiveness. And I think you can see in all of these examples how that reverberates, and that you are all just beautifully making a symphony of that. It's your vision, but it is with a collective lens, and that one thing leads to another, leads to another. I'm so thankful. Okay, 1 minute for a question.
Oh,
Pop it out.
Colette, go ahead.
Oh, yeah, Keisha, thank you. I too am from my grandparents are from Guyana. They came to America around maybe around World War I. they never spoke about Guyana. I didn't even know that they spoke Spanish. But I'm just wondering, does your work at all include issues of slavery, or especially like with the series with your dad?
So if I guess I'm kind of curious in terms of what do you mean by that? Like in terms of, like, am I kind of directly discussing slavery in Guyana? Is that the question?
Yes. I mean, did he talk? It doesn't really sound like he talked much about Guyana. And
No,
uh-huh.
no, we have like I talk to my dad probably like every week. And like he'll share stories with me about, his experiences there. So and I go back. One of the things I didn't get a chance to show, but it's later, but I go back almost every year. So I've been going back and documenting family there.
Oh, that's excellent. Great. I'm happy to hear that
Mhm.
you're making that connection and keeping that connection.
Oh, absolutely.
Good.
I'm happy to entertain another question if we can. And ask our panelists if the two of you have anything you want to share that didn't get put out.
Aldeide?
No, I mean, no, but I was thinking on Keisha's, I mean, as she was referring to this notion of photography in relation with time, with mobility. I am fascinated by the passport photo series, and I hope to see it. Until which date is up, Keisha?
So both shows are up through May.
Okay, perfect. So I can go. I can go. Um, But yeah, also I don't know if you have this notion of disturbing neutrality as a category, but I was thinking as well about that notion. So really, yeah, I don't have like a question, just like a couple of thoughts to keep yeah, considering her work.
Mhm.
I was going to jump in with two thoughts. One is I was so impressed looking at all the presentations in the output decisions, the creative decisions when showing the work in terms of the materiality, in terms of how when you put together, as you were calling it, the conversation of a curation, that you think about layering the concept within the very experience and the materiality. I thought of it through Susan's when she had the images of the crossings in between the other documents. Your conjuring is just filled with this kind of depth of really reverberating. And I had a quote that I came across I wanted to share because I thought it really summed up what we're talking about. It's an old, not old, it's a quote from Eudora Welty, so it has been around for a while, but it says, but the memory is a living thing. It too is in transit. But during its moments, all that is remembered joins and lives. The old and the young, the past and the present, the living and the dead.
Mhm.
I thought that really summed up. I feel we are kicking the doors open here. Yeah, redefining.
Well, thank you, Sib. I think that was a great way to bring this to a close. I think we're already after our 90-minute time for this. And really, thank you, Sib. Thank you, Keisha.
Mhm.
Thank you, Aldeide. Thank you, Susan, who's not here. And thank you all for being here today. And why don't we give an applause to our panelists and moderator.
And can I just, one thing, I see questions coming up about books on the archive. On my website, I have a tab for resources, and I will be circling back because on my Instagram yesterday, I had a stack of books on the archive, and I didn't even include half of the others, so I will make up a list for that. Yeah.
What's your website, Sib?
jsybyllasmith.com. And on Instagram, where I throw out a lot, it's jsybylla. Yeah, I use that as a resource amplifier.
All right. Well, thank you,
So
everybody. Hope to
thankful.
see you at additional programs we're doing this remainder of this spring. And
Thank you.
good, everybody.
Thank you so much.
All right, bye, Aldeide.
Thank you. Thank you so much.
Bye, Glenn. Thanks, Marissa.
Aldeide, I
Thank you.
loved it that we spoke about the Congress and that Susan spoke about that. I don't think I've ever been at anything that blew my mind consistently. It was like it was unbelievable. Yeah.
No, I mean, thank you. I look forward to repeating the experience and, 2027. Here we go.
I'm there.
Thank you.
Yeah, yeah. And Keisha, the fact that you can still put together you have been spoken to, and oh my goodness, all of these exhibits, and it's beautiful. And of course, you focused on all the people in Conjuring.
And very, very refreshing
Love
too.
that.
When I went today to the show at the ICP, I was just taking the time to analyze the construction of the story, because I was like, oh, this is another kind of narrative here. So it was like coming back and forth, and really, yeah, I enjoyed the show.
Thank you. Thank you. It's my pride and joy. I love that show so much.
Can't wait to see it.
Glad it's up for a little bit more.
Yes, yes. Well, okay.
All right, I'm going to press the end meeting for all.
We don't want to leave. I don't want to. And we don't get a dance party, at least at the Congress. We get a dance party at the end.
Oh my God. And Keisha, but I am going to text you.
Thank you. Please. Okay.
Thank
Okay.
you.
Okay.
Bye.
Well,
All
bye.
right. All right, Glenn, you can cut us.
Well, actually, I have another meeting to go to. I'm just going to press the leave meeting button. I think it leaves the meeting open, and you could stay on and continue talking. Yeah.
Well, I do have to go.
All right.
Yeah.
We're good.
Okay.
We're good.
I'm pushing the leave button. I'm sorry.
Okay. All right. We'll see ya.
Bye.